Well, let me just, if I could, follow up a little bit on one. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I told the chairman earlier, I thought I was the last speaker when I questioned last time, so I went a little long because I was the only one in the room. But in this new virtual world, we had others, so I apologize to my colleagues for taking more time. The third threat I did want to talk about was this domestic terrorism threat, and sometimes it's white supremacists, anti-Semitic, as an example, hateful attacks, or sometimes it's Islamic extremists. But this is something that, again, the department has begun to focus on more. Mr. Cuccinelli, I understand that DHS recently released the implementation plan for your countering terrorism and targeted violence strategic framework. And this committee, again, has been very active on a particular part of the response, which is these nonprofit security grant programs. It basically is a FEMA grant program that goes out usually to a faith-based organization, say a synagogue, a church, or a mosque, but all nonprofits are eligible, and it's for security enhancements, and now can be used, thanks to DHS, even for armed security. But a lot of it is just about getting the expertise, being sure that these organizations know where do you place the cameras, how do you ensure that things are locked, and you can help them by just doing a walkthrough often. 32 organizations in Ohio have received a combined total of $2.3 million in grants in fiscal year 2020, and they are using it well, in my view, and I've had a chance to visit with them. One thing we did last year that I thought was quite effective is we had a conference in Ohio, in Columbus, Ohio, and we had the FBI there, Director Ray. They did a great job. We also had DHS there, Secretary Cuccinelli, and they did a great job of just explaining what the threat was and kind of starting down the process of, what do you do to respond to it. And the folks in the room, this was the Sikh community, the Muslim community, the Jewish community, the Christian community, everybody was there. People really appreciated it, and I think that's one thing to think about, is the possibility of doing more of these around the country, where you have a conference and bring together some of the leadership, and just so people get a better sense, one, of what is going on in the real world out there in terms of this threat, and it's not a it's not a classified environment, but you're able to provide some very good information. And then second, what do you do about it? So that's my question to you, is what more can we do? I know you have a new grant program. I'd like to hear about that. But if the two of you could speak, or all three of you, speak briefly about this issue, that'd be great.
Yeah, just this month, the first tranche of the new grant dollars, I want to say $10 million, went out to 29 recipients. And that is, as so much of the DHS responsibility in the domestic arena is prevention. It's goes hand in hand with standing up TVTP, the office there for targeted violence, and we're doing it. Some people are familiar with the UK model. They have this big, huge group of people works for their federal government that goes out to try to interdict terrorism, not in a law enforcement fashion, but more in more like an intervention before violence occurs. That is a very different model than we're taking. We have just started building out. We've got our first 12 full-time employees for regional directors to expand partnerships so that we get a whole of America, including working with exactly those nonprofits you're talking about, Senator, to integrate them into our preventive efforts. Both planning for their resistance to potential for assaults, but also for their partnership in intervening when they see people going down a path that may lead them to violence. And so that's the approach that we're taking in that office. It's one of the areas of greatest expansion that you'll see over the course of the next year at the Department of Homeland Security as we grow that effort out into communities across the country. And certainly you describe one way that those contacts can be made more deeply and more quickly, and we're very open to repeating that sort of performance.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the commitment to it. I think it does make sense. In a sense, you're leveraging the federal dollar significantly by getting this cooperation. As Director Miller knows, in Columbus, Ohio, I think the first indictment was made several years ago of an Islamic terrorist who FBI had worked with and through an informant, and we were able to stop a horrific act. What really happened was that the community, the Muslim community in Columbus, Ohio, was cooperating with local, state, federal law enforcement to be able to find that individual. and to prevent what would have been a terrible loss of life. So that's an example where just having those relationships made a big difference, and it was at every level of government. I don't know if you have any thoughts on this, either Director Ray or Director Miller.
I guess I would just add that I think community engagement is something that's critical to dealing with the what we consider the biggest threat to the homeland, which is this combination of homegrown violent extremists and domestic violent extremists, all of whom are typically lone actors, easily radicalized online, attacking soft targets with readily accessible weapons. And because that's such a challenge for law enforcement, the one thing that we've seen, both with the attacks we've thwarted and prevented and, unfortunately, the attacks that have occurred that we've investigated after the fact, is that almost every time, if you look back, there was someone along the way, a friend, a family member, a coworker, a neighbor, a classmate, what have you, who knew the person well enough to notice the transformation from radicalization of whatever kind it was to mobilization. And so you've often heard the saying, if you see something, say something. And most of us, when we hear that, we think the unattended backpack in the Greyhound bus terminal or something. And of course, we want people to call when that happens. But we're trying to push out through all of our field offices, and I've been to all 56 of them and met with communities, I think, in every single one. If you see something about somebody, we need you to say something. And I've been encouraged by those instances where sometimes, having wrestled with great interpersonal demons, a family member, a parent will say, and you think about how hard that is, my child, my 18, 19-year-old child is going off the rails, and I'm concerned he might do something. And they call us, and it's a heck of a lot better situation if we, both for them and more importantly for the public, if we can do something before that person acts.
Thank you, Mr. Director. Thank you, Mr.
Thanks,
Chairman.
Portman.